What if one of fashion's most controversial comebacks didn't happen at Dior, Margiela, or another couture house, but at Zara? John Galliano was once the designer who made fashion feel dangerous, theatrical, and alive again. He didn't just design clothes, he built entire worlds, turning runways into fantasy, history, romance, and chaos. At Dior, he became one of the most powerful creative forces in modern fashion. But then, in 2011, it all collapsed. After his antisemitic remarks in Paris, Galliano was fired from Dior, condemned publicly, and pushed out of the industry that had once treated him like an icon. And yet, fashion has a complicated memory. First came the slow return through Maison Margiela, where he rebuilt his creative authority almost piece by piece. And now, in 2026, Galliano is back again, not through another protected couture house, but through Zara. So is this redemption, opportunism, or proof that fashion will always make room for talent when it becomes useful again? To understand why John Galliano's comeback still creates so much tension, we first have to understand why fashion became so obsessed with him in the first place. Because Galliano didn't arrive as a polished luxury designer with a perfect business plan. He arrived as something much more unpredictable, a young designer with an almost cinematic imagination, someone who seemed to treat clothing less like product and more like storytelling. Before the giant Dior sets, before the couture mythology, before he became one of fashion's most famous names, he was a student at Central St. Martin's with a talent that was already impossible to ignore. His 1984 graduate collection, Les Incroyables, became one of those fashion moments that almost sounds too perfect to be real. Inspired by post-revolutionary France, full of historical references, drama, romance, and attitude, it didn't look like the work of someone politely entering the industry. It looked like someone trying to rewrite what fashion could feel like. The silhouettes were theatrical, the styling was strange and seductive, and the whole thing had the kind of atmosphere that made people stop and pay attention. And that is exactly what happened. Joan Burstein, the legendary owner of Browns in London, bought the entire collection. Almost overnight, Galliano went from promising student to the designer people were suddenly watching. But what made that moment so interesting is that he still wasn't really built like a businessman. He had the imagination, the instinct, the eye, but not the infrastructure. His early work was often made under chaotic circumstances, with limited money, limited resources, and a label that could be creatively electric one moment and financially unstable the next. But in a strange way, that was part of the mythology. Galliano represented a kind of fashion that didn't feel calculated. You could see it in the bias-cut dresses that became one of his signatures, in the historical tailoring, the strange romantic silhouettes, and the way his women often looked less like models and more like characters pulled from another century. And somehow, instead of feeling like costume, it became fashion. That was his gift. He could make the theatrical feel desirable. And you can see why the industry became hooked on him. Even when the business around him struggled, the vision was undeniable. He was not the easiest designer to package, manage, or commercialize, but he had something more valuable than polish. He had a point of view. By the early 1990s, that point of view had become impossible for Paris to ignore. After years of financial instability and near misses, Galliano staged the kinds of shows that reminded people why fashion mattered beyond selling clothes. They didn't just present garments. They created a mood. That talent was exactly what made the big houses notice him. By the mid-1990s, fashion was changing. Luxury was no longer just about quiet prestige or beautifully made clothes. It was becoming a global business built on image, spectacle, and desire. The major houses needed designers who could do more than maintain tradition. They needed people who could turn heritage into something alive again. Something that could sell not just dresses, but perfumes, handbags, makeup, and the entire fantasy around the name. And Galliano was almost perfectly built for that moment. In 1995, he was appointed creative director of Givenchy, becoming the first British designer to lead a French couture house. It was a historic appointment, but it was also a signal of where fashion was going. The industry was no longer looking only for elegant caretakers. It wanted personalities. It wanted theater. It wanted designers who could make a house feel like an event. And then came Dior. When Galliano moved to Christian Dior, everything became bigger. The budgets, the expectations, the stage, the mythology. Dior gave him the kind of platform his imagination had always seemed to demand. Suddenly, the worlds he had been building with limited resources could become full-scale productions. Ancient Egypt, Belle Epoque Paris, geishas, pirates, aristocrats, showgirls. Under Galliano, Dior became a place where fashion didn't simply walk down the runway, it performed. And whether you loved it or thought it was too much, you couldn't really ignore it. That was the point. Galliano understood that a fashion show could be more than a presentation. It could be a memory, a headline, a feeling. And that was incredibly valuable to a luxury house. Because couture itself was not the whole business. It was the dream engine. It created the emotion that helped sell everything around it. But that kind of success comes with a cost. The more Galliano delivered fantasy, the more the machine demanded from him. Dior, his own label, couture, ready-to-wear, pre-collections, accessories, the workload kept expanding, and the designer who once built worlds from instinct was now expected to keep producing them on an industrial rhythm. Fashion loved the magic, but it also wanted the magic on schedule. And that tension matters. Because Galliano's rise wasn't just the story of a brilliant designer being given a stage. It was the story of what happens when creativity becomes a business model. For a while, the fantasy held. The shows kept coming, the image kept growing, but behind it, the pressure was already building. And by 2011, the fantasy could no longer hide what was happening behind it. For years, Galliano had been one of the most celebrated designers in the world, but he was also becoming increasingly fragile. The workload was relentless, the pressure kept growing, and his addiction issues were no longer just private struggles in the background. That context matters, but it does not erase what happened next. In February 2011, Galliano was involved in a series of incidents at La Perle, a cafe in Paris. He was recorded making antisemitic and racist remarks, including comments that caused immediate outrage once the footage became public. Almost overnight, the industry that had treated him as one of its great creative geniuses had to confront something it could not turn into mythology. Dior moved quickly. Galliano was suspended, then fired from the house. Natalie Portman, the face of Miss Dior Cherie, called his remarks deeply shocking and disgusting, and declared she would not be associated with him in any way. Later that year, a Paris court found him guilty of making racist and anti-Semitic insults, giving him a suspended fine. It was not just a career setback. It was a collapse of image, trust, and public standing all at once. And what made it even more complicated was that Galliano's work still mattered. His influence was everywhere. But the person behind it had become impossible to celebrate in the same uncomplicated way. So Galliano disappeared from the center of the industry. He entered rehab, lost Dior, lost his place at the top of couture, and became one of fashion's most difficult names to talk about. And that is what makes the next chapter so uncomfortable. Because fashion did not forget John Galliano. It just had to decide how and when it could let him back in. The return did not happen all at once. At first, it came carefully, almost cautiously. In 2013, Galliano was given a short residency at Oscar de la Renta, a move that felt less like a full comeback and more like a test. Could the industry be seen standing near him again? Could his talent be separated, even slightly, from the damage of what had happened? The answer was complicated, but fashion was clearly not done with him. Then, in 2014, Renzo Rosso took the bigger risk. Through OTB, he brought Galliano to Maison Margiela, and in many ways, it was the only house where that return could have made sense. Margiela was not Dior. It was not built on celebrity glamour or the designer as a visible king of the runway. Its entire identity had been shaped around anonymity, deconstruction, and the idea that clothing could be taken apart and reimagined without needing a loud personality at the center, and that made it almost strangely perfect. Galliano, the ultimate storyteller, entered a house that had once tried to erase the designer from the story. At Dior, he had built fantasy by adding more drama, more characters, more spectacle, more everything. At Margiela, he had to work differently. He had to take things apart. He had to rethink construction, memory, and identity through a quieter but still deeply theatrical lens. And slowly, that tension started to work. His Margiela years were not a loud return to the world he had lost. They were more controlled, more intellectual, more protected. It allowed the industry to look at him again through the work before fully confronting the public meaning of his comeback. And piece by piece, season by season, Galliano began to rebuild what had once seemed almost impossible to recover: creative authority. By 2024, that authority became impossible to ignore. His Maison Margiela artisanal show under the Pont Alexandre III in Paris became one of those rare fashion moments that cut through everything else. The distorted silhouettes, the porcelain-like makeup, the Versailles-inspired atmosphere, the feeling of characters emerging from some forgotten Parisian underworld. It reminded people why Galliano had mattered in the first place. Not because the past had disappeared, but because the talent was still there. And that is where the conversation became uncomfortable again. Because the show was not just praised, it was celebrated. It was treated as proof that fashion could still feel strange, emotional, and transporting in an era that often feels too polished and too safe. For many people inside the industry, Galliano had not only returned, he had reminded fashion of something it had been missing. But Margiela was still a protected space. It was conceptual, insider, surrounded by people who understood the language, the references, the history. It allowed Galliano to rebuild inside the fashion world before being fully pushed back into the mainstream. And that is why what happened next felt so different. Because after leaving Margiela, the question was where Galliano would go. Another couture house? A return to Dior? A new maison built around his name? Instead, the next chapter came from somewhere much more visible, much more commercial, and much harder to contain. Zara. This changes the story because Zara is not a protected fashion space. It is not a couture house, not a conceptual maison, not the kind of place where only editors, collectors, and fashion students are paying attention. Zara is mass market. It is global. It is visible in a way most luxury houses are not. And that is why Galliano's next chapter suddenly feels bigger than just another designer collaboration. In 2026, Zara announced a 2-year creative partnership with John Galliano, built around the idea of reauthoring the brand's archives. Not simply designing a capsule from scratch, but taking pieces from Zara's past and reworking them through his own creative language. On paper, it sounds like a very modern fashion idea. Archive, reconstruction, sustainability, accessibility. But the moment Galliano's name is attached to it, it becomes much more complicated. Because what does it mean for a designer like Galliano to return through Zara? For Zara, the move is obvious in one sense. The brand has spent years trying to push its image beyond fast fashion, working with names like Narciso Rodriguez and Stefano Pilati, producing more elevated campaigns and positioning itself closer to the language of high fashion. Galliano gives Zara something no amount of clean styling can easily buy: mythology. He brings history, controversy, theater, and the kind of creative authority that instantly makes people look twice. But Galliano gets something from Zara too. He gets scale. He gets access to an audience far beyond the couture salon. And maybe most importantly, he gets to step outside the old luxury system without disappearing from fashion's center. He doesn't need to return to Dior or Balenciaga to make the industry talk. Zara has already done that for him. And that is where the discomfort sits. Because this can be read as democratizing Galliano's creativity, making his ideas available to people who could never touch couture. But it can also be read as something more strategic. A fast fashion giant, borrowing the aura of one of fashion's most complicated geniuses and a designer using the biggest retail machine in the world to enter his next act. Maybe both things are true. And maybe that is why this comeback feels so fascinating. Galliano's talent was never really in question. The question was always what fashion would do with it after everything that happened. Margiela answered that question inside the industry. Zara brings it to the public. So now I'm curious. Do you see John Galliano's partnership with Zara as a true second chance, a smart commercial move, or proof that fashion will always make room for genius once it becomes useful again? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.